Hi, my name's Anna Peeters. I'm a public health researcher and the director of the Institute for Health Transformation at Deakin University. And it's really great to be talking to you about my experience writing and getting grants. I think it's a really key part of being an academic and a researcher, and there's definitely lots of highs and lows. So I've spent the last 30 years applying for research funding to support my research ideas. And this funding has ranged from small grants, around $15,000 from small organisations who have been kind of interested in what we're doing, to a quite large grant from the Medical Research Futures Fund focused on rural and regional rapid applied research translation of around $9 million over 5 years. So that range of granting organisations and grant types and grant amounts has given me quite a bit of experience, both in terms of thinking about applying for them, but then also managing them at the end, which is not what I'm talking about today, but I think is another good topic for you guys to think about. So in all, I've been successful with over around $40 million in research funding, and I've had roles from CIA to any number of CIs down to J, to AIs, and I've had funding from governments, from non-government organisations, from health organisations, and from national research funders like our NHMRC, MRFF, ARC, both nationally and internationally. And so one of the questions I was asked to think about was, what's the first thing that I do when I decide to apply for a particular grant? And I think the most important thing for me is always making sure that I have a clear and compelling research question. So I see it really a bit like preparing the drafting of a journal article or a paper, a publication. My approach is generally to dot point what I see as the key rationale, the gaps that I'm trying to address, the research question that's going to address those gaps, the approach that I'm going to use to deliver on the research question to address the gaps, and then the outcomes that I expect from that approach to address the research question, to address the gaps. And as you've probably picked up, I think one of the most important things is actually to make sure they all align. It can be really easy to get excited about a method or an approach or some data you want to gather without really having done the rigorous work of thinking about what actually does the world need in this area, what actually is the research gap, and what actually is the research question I need to answer to address that gap. And now is the study I'm thinking of actually going to meet those needs? So that would be my overarching advice, to be really, really rigorous with yourself about that kind of process. Once I've done that, then I usually think about a trusted group of colleagues to test that dot point 1 or 2 pager with, and that can be either on paper or in a workshop where I share my ideas. And at the same time as I'm doing that, I check that the idea, the format, the setting, the outcomes that I'm thinking about all meet the requirements of the grant opportunity that I intend to go for. And finally, I think about the timeframes. So whether it's realistic to get a grant together that's going to be really, really top quality, or whether I'd be better off aiming for a future grant round. So in doing all that, if I think about the question of what do I find most challenging when writing grants and what do I do about it, I think one of the really challenging things for researchers is to allow your grant to evolve in response to feedback and your own further thinking and reading. I think it's really easy for us to stay too tightly linked to our original concept, even if it's not quite working. And so I think sort of related to that is making sure that you're really rigorous in assessing how your application does address the grant criteria. So they are provided for a reason, they're quite detailed, so use them. And if you're not addressing the grant criteria, be honest, and you either need to change your grant or you go for a different grant round. One of the things I've learned is to trust my gut instinct. So if your gut instinct is saying you are too light on in a particular area, maybe you think, oh, I could do a bit better with the rationale, could do a bit better with the methods, I could do better with the translation, then it's probably true. So really listen to your gut and don't go, oh, it'll be okay. It won't be. You won't be in the top competitive 10%. No lip service to those different grant criteria or to your kind of innate knowledge of what a really, really high quality project looks like. So kind of building on that, I'm going to sort of repeat myself a little bit. I was asked what are the top 3 tips for emerging researchers? And so kind of pulling a whole lot of that together, I'd say the first one is really, feedback, feedback, feedback at all stages of your grant writing process and from a wide variety of people. And it can be really scary. And it's hard to deal with feedback, but honestly, I think it's the most valuable thing you can do is to train yourself to seek it and be open to it and really deeply consider, do you agree with the feedback? And if so, what are you going to do to respond to it? At the Institute for Health Transformation, we introduced these grant feedback sessions, which have been really fantastic. Also look out for things like internal and external grant review schemes, and make sure you've got non-experts reviewing it. So they may not be expert in your subject area, but they can be really, really helpful to tell you whether it's readable, whether it's understandable. And as I said, once you've got that feedback, take it on board. The second point, which I've already mentioned, is using the assessment criteria. I think you need to be really comprehensive in reviewing what you've written against those criteria. And as I said, if you can't find a criterion addressed, make sure you add some information in to address that criterion. One of the things that can feel a bit tacky at first, but you over time find it really useful, is to try and use the words that the grant body uses. So look at the criterion and use their words in your grant application. And what all these things do is essentially signpost for the reviewers. So when you're reviewing kind of your fully drafted grant, one of the things I always look out for is how easy have you made it for reviewers to see how you have addressed each specific criterion. So it might be that you've put information showing about how your track record shows the feasibility of your methods. But if that's not spelled out under feasibility, then often the grant reviewer won't make that link themselves. So really make sure for every criterion you have something like a subheading or the words from the criterion used in your grant so that the assessor can go through and say, yep, tick, tick, tick. And then my final top tip is going back to the very first thing I said. You really need to make sure your rationale is clear and compelling. One of the most common things I see when reviewing people's grants is that they're quite convoluted, really hard to make sense of. It might be quite a good idea, but you don't really understand if the problem's the most important problem, if the gap that's been identified is the most important gap to address for that problem, if the research question's really going to address that gap, and if the methods are really appropriate for that research question. And one phrase that one of my mentors told me a long time ago, which I still use, is think about your grant, have you really communicated to the reviewers why this, why now, and why you? So another way of saying those things is your question clear? There's so many grants I read where the research question is a double negative or has 3 components to it. Simple is always better. Do you have a strong rationale in the burden, in the gap? Do the methods address the question? Are they feasible? Have you demonstrated that you've got the required expertise? And have you clearly thought about what you will do with the outcomes of the grant, regardless of what they are? So hopefully some of those tips will be of use to you. And I guess the bottom line is, trust yourself. If you've got a good idea, you're the expert in the field. It likely is. So now your job is trying to think about a really, really clear way of communicating that idea, making sure the methods are feasible, and thinking about the team with whom to do it. So good luck, and I look forward to seeing all your excellent grants.